church diplomacy and the religious dimension of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Right now we are starting our third panel session, I would say the most interesting, entitled Challenges for Ecumenical Dialogue. My name is Father Roman Filas. I represent the Institute of Ecumenical Studies of the Ukrainian Catholic University. Ecumenism as a movement for the Christian unity, according to many theologians, has been experiencing a kind of ongoing crisis during these recent years, or maybe even decades. It manifests itself in different ways, this crisis. For example, the absence of the serious rapprochement between the churches, the absence of a common Christian position on important moral and social issues, the instrumentalization of dialogue for propaganda reasons, and many, many other signs. The full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine only manifested, exposed those problems that in fact existed long time before, which until then were often cleverly masked behind various political theological narratives. Today on this panel, we will analyze the challenges and prospects of ecumenical movement both in Ukraine and in the world, raised because of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And a cohort of respect experts will analyze the nature and causes of these challenges in the field of interchurch relations, so that theologians, religious experts, representatives of churches can rethink the ecumenical engagement in order to jointly seek answers. Our first speaker came from Kyiv. Her name is Olександра Коваленко. She is member of the Ukrainian Association of Religious Studies in Kyiv. The name of the topic is Ukrainian Ecumenism in Action, Challenges and Perspectives. So, Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Father Roman, and thank you for the invitation, for the possibility to speak here. I will speak from a very interesting position, I believe, as I have more practical experience in ecumenism for the past year. I am sure that there are lots of us who understand ecumenism in theory well and know the history of the movement, but I will speak more from the practical perspective, being the scholar of religious studies and having the history of being a representative from the church, from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, both on the WCC assembly and just last week the assembly of the Conference of European Churches. Being there as a youth representative and woman is also a quite interesting place. So I will speak mostly from this perspective and talk about some challenges as well as some positive, hopeful moments that I hope we'll see in future for the ecumenism, both internationally and in Ukraine. Starting from the international perspective, I'd like to say that as a result of the aggression, of course, there has been more interest to Ukraine and inclusion of Ukrainian churches in the different dialogue initiatives, and Ukrainian churches are much more well represented now on the international platforms. As an example of that was the last-minute decision to invite 3 delegations of Ukrainian churches to the WCC assembly, which was taken just a few months before the assembly. And it was a kind of an extraordinary event because such events, it happens once in 8 years, and this time it was almost 9 years, I think, 9.5 because of COVID. So taking this decision last minute, it was really a very important sign of support towards Ukraine and Ukrainian churches. So the result of that, there were 3 delegations, one representing the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, another one representing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and then the joint delegation of the All Ukrainian Association of Religious Communities. So this gives a chance, a unique chance to Ukrainian churches to be present and to speak for themselves instead of being spoken about them without their own inclusion. But it also brings the huge responsibility to the churches in a way that they interact with the international community and the messages that they speak, in the way they speak, and it is a very important place to be in. The second positive moment I'd like to mention is that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine's application for the Conference of European Churches has been recently accepted. Unfortunately, it was not accepted on the previous meeting, which would have given them the chance to be full delegates on this assembly, so this time they were just as observers again, but at the next meeting there will be full members, and I think it's also a great example for other European churches and religious communities to try and apply for the membership in these organizations, because it is very important to be represented, and until recently the only Ukrainian church which was represented was the Transcarpathian Lutheran Church, Protestant Church. They are the member of KETS. But as a result of the inclusion of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, one of the member churches left the organization as a sign of the protest to this action. And I think another important moment is also the inside the Orthodox, being a representative of the Orthodox Church, I'd like to stress on the importance also of the recognition of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine by other local Orthodox churches, and I think this process could be also taken into account, and more maybe attention would be given to that. Being a researcher, I give myself a freedom to criticize a little bit maybe today. But there are some also challenges and not so positive moments, so I believe that we need more initiative in the advocacy and in religious advocacy, because it is very important, and there are some spheres where churches, as we mentioned on the previous panel and yesterday, there are some spheres where churches can take initiative, can contribute more in the field of humanitarian aid, in some other spheres where the voice of churches can be heard more than of the political actors and, for example, non-governmental organizations. So it is very important that the churches are proactive in this regard and they take the initiative. So I think the more systematic approach is also needed, so that this process would not be just one of two meetings from time to time, but more a systematic approach with special people who have all the necessary training and knowledge who would contribute to this process. Second of all, I'd like to say that it is very important to include also the youth and use the opportunities for youth and young priests to study abroad, to visit different institutions and universities, ecumenical dialogue. There is a ecumenical institute in Bosnia, for example, so I think it's a nice idea to send the representatives of the Ukrainian churches there regularly, so they will participate, they will meet people from other religious tradition, and they will be included in that process, because the Russian Orthodox Church uses every opportunity to be present and to present their own narratives, so we're also responsible to be there proactively and speak for ourselves. It is also, I think, very important to include lay people and to use their kind of energy and time and everything, because in Orthodox Church, unfortunately, I think we're mostly focused on the preparation of priests and clergy and their education, but not many opportunities for lay people to be present and be active and somehow be included into church life and inner church connections and relations. So I think there is also a place to further work in this regard. It is also very important to understand that unfortunately the ecumenical platforms are used for propaganda, And therefore it is important to be aware of the context, because people, and it's something that we observed at the WCC especially, people from further regions, from other churches, for example Orthodox churches from Africa or from Asia, they're not very familiar with the context, they don't understand much what's going on, and therefore they are very prone to some propaganda. And it was quite obvious sometimes in personal communication that those people, they're just kind of repeating the messages that they see from the media, from propaganda, and therefore we need to know the exact context of that countries, that churches, to be able to oppose them and to be able to convince them of what is going on. So I think for the church, one of the main goals is to be the witnesses. So Ukrainian churches could be the witnesses of what's happening in our country and be present. And to end this part, I think the personal contacts work the best. So where there is opportunity for personal communication and establishing those contacts, cooperation, it will in future be more fruitful. So, for example, I've met a representative of from the islands in the Atlantic Oceans, and he was selected as a member. He was selected as a member of the Central Committee, and before the Central Committee, he later messaged me asking to explain to him the situation in the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. And I've taken some time and sent him the articles, so he went there more well prepared, and he said that he will continue and kind of advocate for our church and our situation. So I think the personal contacts should not be disregarded, and it's very important to establish them. Continuing the topic of propaganda, I'd like also to say that the Russian Orthodox Church, they use these international platforms and ecumenical platforms very thoughtfully for the propaganda messages and spreading them. One of the instances was when the participant started saying those common people are not aggressors. For example, my mother, she's just a regular teacher, so she's innocent, so why should we say that all Russians are bad because she's a nice person and so on. And unfortunately we could see that those messages were very well received by international audiences, and they were kind of sympathizing with him, and they, oh, he's so sad, it's such a bad situation for his family, which to us as Ukrainians was quite shocking and hurtful, I would say. But for people coming from far away, who are not very well aware of the context and don't have the connection to Ukraine and don't understand probably the situation as much as we do, it was quite touching. So it's very important to be careful with those messages being spread. And also the in-between problem with ecumenism, but it's coming further, is the problem with pastoral care of Ukrainian refugees, which has been discussed inside Ukraine on a few events and conferences. We have in the Orthodox Church of Ukraine a special commission which was created, but the real mechanism for the pastoral care and support of Ukrainians, Orthodox Ukrainians outside of Ukraine who are now in different European countries has not been yet developed, which also creates, I would say, both a challenge and a chance, about which I will talk later. Speaking about the inner Ukrainian challenges for the ecumenism, first of all, I'd like to say, of course, about the violence and escalation of the division in the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. We talked about it for the whole session yesterday, and everyone, I think, is aware of the situation. The escalation is not, excuse me, is not well received outside of Ukraine, both by the political actors and by the church actors, of course. There are not much understanding, and there is some, I would say it's a weak spot, so the Ukrainian government should now be very careful with how we proceed with the situation, so it won't be used against us. Speaking about the dialogue between the Orthodox churches, it is quite obvious that the regular priests and lay people are more willing to cooperate and include in the dialogue rather than the hierarchy, and it is also the problem. So the situation which we're now facing in Ukraine, inside of Ukraine, regarding the Ukrainian Orthodoxy can be used for manipulation on the international platforms, which we also should be aware of. The same situation gives a very big setback for dialogue initiatives which have been present in 2018, 19, 2020. I participated in a project which was cooperated, it was the peace initiatives with the help of the churches. So we made it for half a year, and we presented some results, some recommendations for the religious organizations, how they can include a non-violent communication and everything. But unfortunately, for the past months, we can see that there is a huge step back in those initiatives for obvious reasons. There is also, I would say, a more positive way that churches can collaborate is humanitarian aid and humanitarian aid projects, and we have seen the examples of that. But on the other side, there is a possibility of the negative tendencies of comparing one's contribution and help, which churches sometimes use to stress on how much they've done and what should have been done by other representatives of other church communities, which is not helping with the dialogue initiatives and cooperation. So one should also be very careful in that regard. Another very important and positive moment is that the chaplain programs for preparing the chaplains for the ministry in the army, they are interdenominational and interreligious. So all the chaplains are studying at the same programs, they study together, and I think that it is also a very unique and important place, because the context of the chaplain work is quite different from regular pastoral care and the work that the priests have on the parishes. So, of course, there is no chance that Ukrainian government and state could give, I don't know, the Orthodox priest, Catholic priest, Protestant priest to every military unit. So, regularly there is just one chaplain that is responsible for the military unit. Who comes there, who lives with the military, and it creates, first of all, an experience for the military to be engaged with different religious traditions. For example, Orthodox soldiers can witness the Greek Catholic priests and listen to his prayers, to his preaching, to be more aware of the tradition, because I would say that unfortunately in Ukraine, even though the traditions have quite a long connection historically, but we're not very well aware of one another, and not many people, for example, have the experiences of visiting the liturgy of another tradition. So it creates a very unique environment in which it is also a great place for pastoral care and support from the side of these chaplains to assist the military. They should also have the proper, I would say, psychological training in order to be helpful and to provide all the necessary care and for people in need in the battlefield or the front lines or close to that area. And continuing this topic, I'd like again to say that in my opinion it's a very positive moment that many Ukrainian refugees who are now staying in different European countries, many of them are Orthodox, but because we have just the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church parishes outside of Ukraine, many of them go to those parishes for service and so on. And in my opinion, it is a very positive tendency because, first of all, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic parishes are the centers, so to say, of the Ukrainian identity and cultural identity. They have all the different kinds of events. So for those refugees who usually come from the eastern part of Ukraine or from the south of Ukraine, it is a great opportunity to encounter the new church culture, which is different from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, where people who don't attend services much, I'd say it's more about like superstitions and just going to church twice a year than having a real rich religious and church life. So I believe that it's a very positive tendency that they have the opportunity to open this another tradition, to be a part of it, to gain more of the Ukrainian identity. And even though I've heard from some Orthodox priests that they won't later come back to the Orthodox Church, I don't believe it. I believe that it's a very good chance for our traditions to work together and to learn about one another more, because I think it's a very great historical chance. So overall, I think that we have many challenges regarding the ecumenism in Ukraine and outside of it, but I also believe that with the challenge comes a chance, which I just discussed previously, and that I hope that this chance can be used in the ecumenical dialogue too, so that the Ukrainian churches and Ukrainian religious organizations will be more present in the ecumenical sphere and will gain their own unique presence and voice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alexandra, for your presentation, and special thank you that you presented not only the problems and challenges in the ecumenical movement, especially in the work of the World Council of Churches, but you also represent the perspectives appearing in Ukraine even in time of war, about the cooperation of Ukrainians, and it could be an example for all the Christians in the world. Our next speaker, Natalія Василевич, she came from Belarus through Germany, born to Ukraine to participate in our conference. And when I think about Natalija, I think about an ecumenical pioneer presented everywhere on every ecumenical international gatherings, and you have a rich ecumenical potential and knowledge. And today Natalija will share her reflections on abuse of theological concepts in the ecumenical movement in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. I decided a little bit to change my topic. I will still speak about what I intended to do, but also I would like to share my reflection on how churches from Ukraine could be more efficient in the ecumenical arena, and which mistakes probably are done in this involvement. I'm coming from Germany. Now I live in Germany, and I'm not coming from Belarus. Because last time I was in 2020 in Belarus, and I don't know when I will be able to go there next time. And just a few words, because it's connected to my ecumenical experience. So I was in the democratic movement and in the church since 2000. And when I first met the ecumenical movement, I understood that it's a very great opportunity to bring the cause of Christians in Belarus to some arena, and to get some solidarity from other Christians. And so I was always interested to go to all the ecumenical events, yes, that's true, to bring my own causes there, like to trying to promote and trying to resist propaganda of the Russian Church. And when I was in Belarus, of course, we have only Belarusian Orthodox Church, which is part of the Russian Orthodox Church. So I always, all my life, was fighting with leaders of the Russian Church on ecumenical events, trying to present alternative position on almost all issues which were present there. So that's why my experience starts from around 2003 and until now. And also I will say a lot, repeat a lot what Alexandra said, because we were together in both in WCC General Assembly and KEC General Assembly, working as a kind of team to formulate and to somehow present this voice of Ukrainian Christians for the world or European Christianity. So I will start from the reference to WCC Assembly in Karlsruhe, which happened in September 2022. And so my role, something else I add. So Alexandra was doing, especially in Karlsruhe, she was an activist part of the team, and I was diplomatic part of the team, because I was also delegate from the ecumenical patriarchate, and they couldn't anymore be activist, because when you are a delegate, when you have a position, you should be very careful what you say, that your position is not mixed up with the position of the church leaders. So I was one of the main drafters of the document of WCC Assembly, War in Ukraine, Peace and Justice in the European Region, which was adopted by the General Assembly. And another key drafter, together with me, was Hieromonk Штефан Кубе from the Russian Orthodox Church. So you can imagine, I was put in a room with kind of, people with whom I was fighting all my life, and we needed to produce a document which could be adopted by consensus by the General Assembly. So it was very challenging, but after this experience I also started to understand better Pope Francis, for example, when he tries to find better words and not to cut connections, because when you have a task you need to fulfill it. So my task in drafting in such a company was to find a balance between 4 points. First one, to promote formulations against the Russian aggression, against the war, which would be as strong and concrete as possible. To name, it's not a war but aggression, invasion, to put like the formulations to be faithful to the truth, and to be as much concrete as possible in this. On the other hand, second, to prevent manipulations, statements and narratives which could be interpreted or misinterpreted in favor of Russian position to justify a war. For example, civil war in Donbass, expressions like this, I'm sure you know what kind of narratives are often used. So the third one, to find a good factual basis of all statements mentioned in the document. Because it secures position when you have facts, when you have numbers, when you have dates, names, and so on. So you need to have like a toolkit of everything, because when someone starts manipulation, you can just say, on this date this happens, so it doesn't fit to narrative you try to represent. And finally, which was the most difficult, and taking into consideration all of this, to make the document to be accepted by the Russian delegation. So that's like bringing things from poles and try to find this balance that both the document is in favor of Ukraine, but at the same time is accepted by the Russian delegation. So the letter was a necessary requirement for the document to be accepted through a procedure of consensus, which is a procedure by which everything is done in WCC. On the other hand, task of my vis-a-vis, Father Igumnov, was different. First, he needed to justify special military operation, as they call it, by focus on the war in Ukraine since 2014 as a civil war, and therefore to present the current invasion as a result of it, to avoid criticism against Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. Third, to introduce criticism against the Ukrainian government and the issue of human rights and freedom of religion or belief and all other Russian-speaking minorities and so on was a strong point to be promoted. And fourth, to blur the agenda by introducing additional topics. It's also like a tactics which is very much used. So to speak about something different that you need to speak about, and especially you can see it in many documents and in many. So very often when the war in Ukraine is tackled in the ecumenical meetings, the Russians are the first one. Can we say and can we make a strong condemnation of the war at all? So let's not speak only about the war in Ukraine, but every war is bad, and we need to condemn, we need to be very Christians, we are peacemakers, and by this, so they jump in the discussion, condemning the war, and presenting themselves as a peace people, and then it starts to be more difficult to go from this more general condemnation towards the concrete situations that are happening now, here and now, and for which the Russian Orthodox Church is responsible. Finally, to give credits to the Russian Orthodox Church by praising his humanitarian work for Ukrainian refugees. It's also one of things, if you see all the documents of WCC after visits to Russia, this work to Ukrainian refugees help, which we know, like how Lvova Belova, for example, helps Ukrainian refugees in Russia, and so on. But it's very difficult at first places where they bring all delegations from ecumenical movement. It's to some refugee camps where people are happy, they receive some food and clothes and so on. So just to put as much focus as possible, saying we are just a church, we are not intervening in politics, but we are good Samaritans, we help those who need, not asking from where they come. And so, like again, moving the discourse in this direction. Finally, what about the final document? So the final document, the war was directly called the Russian invasion. It was denounced as illegal and unjustifiable. The misuse of religious language and authority to justify armed aggression and hatred was rejected in the document. Also, attention in the document was drawn even to such sensitive problem of Ukrainian refugees in Russia as their experience of dehumanizing and degrading treatment, it's quotation, dehumanizing and degrading treatment of interrogation, tortures and loyalty tests at the filtration camps. And the Russian delegation had to accept it because they were very against that the filtration camps are in the document. But also that's why it was formulated that we receive a lot of reports. So we do not say that there are filtration camps, but we are concerned that there are many reports from people who experience this, where this dehumanizing and degrading treatment. But still, I think it's very important that this mention of filtration camps were inside. Even Archimandrite Cyril Govorun, my friend, who is very, very critical to all documents. Maybe he just wanted to make a compliment to me personally, but so he is very critical to the strategy. He evaluated this document as to be better than many, including myself, expected. So I think it's a very good evaluation. The Russian delegation not only actively participated in drafting the document, but also endorsed it to reach the plenary. And during plenary didn't reject it, passing it through consensus. However, after the document passed, for the domestic audience, they had to formulate their position in ambiguous way. On the one hand, to deny their support of the document by publishing a commentary of the chief of delegation, Metropolitan Anthony, in which it was stated, a delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church could not support by voting this document accepted by the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches. And there was no voting, so of course they couldn't vote for it because consensus procedure and voting procedure is something different. And of course it was kind of a lie because probably they felt the document Patriarch Kirill will not be happy. But so they said we didn't. It was done without our consent, although it's not true. At the same time, they said it was politicized. At the same time, in the statement, there was an expression of careful optimism concerning the balanced position of the World Council of Churches. Clearly, the Russian Orthodox Church official delegation, being unhappy by the outcome of the assembly concerning the war in Ukraine, however, couldn't denounce it, but accepted it and otherwise demonstrated its interest in continuing to regard WCC as a platform for discussion, even if this platform was resistant to promotion of Russian Orthodox Church narratives and positions. 25th of June 2023, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow sent a congratulations to General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Dr. Джеррі Піллай, on the occasion of WCC's 75th anniversary. In his letter, he mentioned the role of WCC as a platform for dialogue and peacemaking, and especially concerning the war in Ukraine. And I quote this letter of Kirill. The tragic events in Ukraine resonate with a particular pain in my heart. The position of the Moscow Patriarchate is clear and unambiguous. We call for preventing further escalation of this conflict. Every possible effort must be made to return blessed peace to the war-torn land as soon as possible, to put an end to the bloodshed as well as to any persecution on religious, political and linguistic grounds. In this regard, I would especially like to note the efforts of Professor Джеррі Піллай, as well as the current and previous leadership of WCC, who have made several trips to Moscow and Kiev in recent months. Regarding the war in Ukraine, on the platform of the World Council of Churches, Kirill, who on many occasions supported the Russian invasion in Ukraine, speaks mainly on peacemaking and uses reference to the concepts such as just peace. So Patriarch Kirill very much likes to speak about just peace. The same strategy he has chosen also in regard to other ecumenical partners. So he doesn't come to ecumenical partners and say, this special military operation is so good, we bless it, and war is instrument of. But he always speaks about just peace. So, for example, 16th of March 2022. With Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, as official communique of the Russian Orthodox Church informs, the discussion was the following. The parties stressed the need to achieve a lasting peace based on justice as soon as possible. Like great theologian of just peace, he promoted this concept, and of course this concept resonates very much with Justin Welby. In the talk with Pope Francis on the same day, the parties stressed the importance of the ongoing negotiation process, expressing their hope for the soonest achievement of just peace. During the recent visit of WCC delegation in May 2023, Patriarch Kirill stressed, I am deeply convinced that that as religious people, we are called upon to contribute to the strengthening of peace and not to take the side of political confrontation. Again, peace everywhere. There is an interesting episode also, in the aftermath of General Assembly of WCC, when Father Yon Sauka came to Moscow to meet Patriarch Kirill, and also in the official communique published by Moscow Patriarchate, it is stated that Father Sauka, in his conversation with Patriarch Kirill, has addressed, and I quote, theological argumentation and support of the war, which for some people were made public in some of your sermons and speeches. So Sauka said, some people heard you say something in support of the war. And in the same communique, the same communique describes surprise of Patriarch Kirill by this statement. And I quote, Patriarch Kirill seemed not to be aware what we speak about. And therefore, the members of the Russian delegation explained that some people just quote certain phrases from Patriarch Kirill's homilies, failing to give full quotations from his speeches and put them in context, and thus using them to engineer accusation against the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church. Yeah, so as we see, like Patriarch Kirill is trying to avoid and trying to rely to different, so the strategies of Russian Church are very developed. And one of strategies, maybe I add with the same guy we were speaking, Alexandra was already referring to, just an example. Youth Assembly was doing a statement on the war, on different issues, and they included also the war in Ukraine in the statement. And then the delegate from Russian Church said, we need also to speak about Palestine, and we need to add Palestine in the same quotation, because people in Palestine are suffering a lot from aggression. So then Ukrainian delegation said, but we need to say also that Ukraine, it's not just the war in Ukraine happening, we need to mention, to name aggressor. Russia is doing the war in Ukraine. It's not war happening somehow, but there is someone who is doing war. And then the delegate of Russian Church said, okay, then we need to put Israel in the same... and then so, of course, those who were supporting Ukraine, they didn't want Israel to be mentioned in the statement. So finally they had to take both Russia and Israel from the statement. And that's how he was not against that the war in Ukraine is mentioned, but he was against it. And it was like a complete manipulation on the documents, how it's happened. But now I will come to my short recommendations. And first one will be that there is, Alexandra said that it's a big opportunity for Ukrainian churches, so that the war brought possibility for Ukrainian Christians to enter ecumenical movement and start to be a voice in the ecumenical movement. But at the same time, it's limitation for the Ukrainian churches, because Ukrainian churches are like having one cause. They speak about the war. And so they're not taken very often credible, because they appear in the ecumenical movement to receive something from the ecumenical movement. So, of course, it's understandable, it's completely legitimate, but it makes the position of Ukrainian churches very weak in the ecumenical movement. Because what is WCC especially? It's an organization which covers churches across the whole globe, and there are very many painful issues, like different military conflicts happening everywhere, like in Pacific, to which Alexandra already referred, the whole islands are disappearing, like people might not see their homelands ever because they will go under the ocean. So that's why it's one of the important things is that Ukrainian churches also know about the problems of other churches and also advocate for other churches. So they bring their voice not only to receive the support, but also be ready to extend the support and be aware of Palestine issue or African problems and so on. Because, like, for example, issue of sanctions, one example, in many churches all over the world, they suffer from sanctions. So there is, in WCC, there is a strong lobby against sanctions, because many churches, like now in Syria or in Cuba or I don't know, in many countries, the churches themselves, they say sanctions are bad. And so when you, for Russian church, it's very easy to speak against the sanctions against Russia, because they say, you see, we all suffer from sanctions, so it's not a good instrument, so let's not have sanctions. So we need to know very well how the sanctions mechanism work, how, in which cases it's really, and we need to agree that in some cases sanctions are bad. And when we have this balanced position, we are becoming more credible as people to make it. We are not fighting for ourselves, not fighting for our interests or for our own pain, but we are fighting for justice, for truth. So our position is not because it's our position, but because we try to be fair and to be fair for everyone. Yeah. So that's to fight for one's cause, it's important not to fight for one's cause only.
Thank you, Natalia, very much. Thank you for stressing that we can't only listen to others, but we have to be active actors and be aware of what is happening in the world and be active actors. But also another important question about should we continue this game which happened in WCC, I mean this diplomatic game, or should we create some reform WCC or create some new organization which will proclaim the good news and not the diplomatic wars between the churches and which are sometimes pursuing their own interests. So this is an open question.
It's a rhetoric question.
Yes. Our next speaker is Штефан Кубе, coming from Zurich, Switzerland, and he's the chief editor of the journal Religion and Society in East and West, and also he is an expert in Eastern Christianity, religious history, and history of Central and Southeastern Europe. Today he presents the topic entitled "To Put Politics Aside," from Джеррі Піллай, Reflections on Theological and Non-Theological Factors within Ecumenical Dialogue.
Thank you, Father Thomas, for the kind introduction, and many thanks for the organizers of the conference for inviting me here. I think it's really important. Yes, as you already said, I chose a statement by Джеррі Піллай for the title of a presentation. He made this statement right after his meeting with Patriarch Kirill last May, mid-May, last month. I add the quotation mark. It's really important to put the quotation mark there. And maybe the next slide. Yeah, you can see the two guys on the slide, and but one back, please. There should be one between. No, back. Yeah, yes. There is here a short outline of my presentation. In the first part, I will show you that we can observe some repeating patterns of distancing from the political sphere by the top religious actors, like the Pope, like the World Council of Churches. And in the second part, I will try to outline some recommendations how to deal with this behavior. But I will start, and then now the next slide, with a movie. Do you remember the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray in the leading role? This comedy from 1993 tells the story of a cynical weatherman covering the annual Groundhog Day event in a small town in Pennsylvania who gets trapped in a time loop. This movie came into my mind when following the recent news on some ecumenical initiatives concerning the war against Ukraine. For example, please next slide. For example, consider the latest visit of the World Council of Churches General Secretary Джеррі Піллай in Moscow in May. The circumstances and the procedure of the meeting between the WCC General Secretary and the Russian Patriarch Kirill were the same as in October 2022, when the acting General Secretary at that time, Father Johann Sauka, visited Moscow. Please, the next slide. In both cases, press releases with, WCC General Secretary meets Patriarch Kirill despite all warning voices beforehand. In both cases, press releases with empty phrases were issued by the WCC afterwards. The Moscow Patriarchate issued press releases as well that show how unprepared and naive the General Secretaries went into talks with the Primate of the Russian Orthodox Church. Faced with public criticism, both Pillai as well as Sauka gave so-called exclusive interview trying to justify their respective journey to Moscow. But exclusive interview meant in both cases an interview with the WCC's own press office, which is a quite remarkable handling of public criticism. So you can replace the both actors. You can see the both pictures from the website of the Moscow Patriarchate, so it's like in the movie with Bill Murray. In a similar way, you could write a script on Pope Francis' approach to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It also reveals recurring patterns during the last year. On the one hand, the Pope has expressed his deep solidarity with Ukraine several times. For example, in his letter to the Ukrainian people in November 2022, quote, "Dear brothers and sisters, in all this great flood of evil and pain, 90 years after the terrible genocide of the Holodomor, I stand in admiration of your steadfast resistance," end of quote. Or he made impressive gestures like kissing a Ukrainian flag from Bucha after the Russian atrocities became known worldwide. On the other hand, the pontiff made more than once ambiguous statements concerning the war of aggression against Ukraine. I come later on this topic. Yes, please. Reading the statements of the WCC's representatives or of Pope Francis, you come across repeating patterns of distancing from the political sphere. For instance, in his letter to the Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Russian President Putin in March 2022, the WCC's acting General Secretary Jurij Avvakumov wrote that he is, quote, "not a politician nor a diplomat either. Therefore, I will write to you this pastoral letter as a priest and a spiritual leader," end of quote. In his report to the WCC Central Committee 3 months later, in June 2022, with regard to the proposal to exclude the Russian Orthodox Church from the WCC, Avvakumov said, quote, "It would be very easy to use the language of the politicians, but we are called to use the language of faith, of our faith. It is easy to exclude, to excommunicate and to demonize, but we are called as WCC to use a free and safe platform of encounter and dialogue," end of quote. The next slide, please. The other direction. Likewise, Avvakumov's successor Pillai emphasizes his distancing from the political sphere. In his exclusive interview, after the meeting with Patriarch Kirill, he said, quote, "The task of the WCC is not to get involved in politics, even though this is necessary for peaceful solutions to real problems." You see the contradiction within the sentence. We do not have a political agenda, and we believe that the Bible calls us to peace. Jesus Christ is the Prince of Peace, and he calls us to work for peace and live in peace with each other. So we have to put the scriptures in front of us to be able to put politics aside, to put nationalism aside. This is a quote for the title. Pillai's approach is accompanied by Heinrich Bedford Strom, the new elected WCC Central Committee moderator, who said in an interview with the German Catholic News Agency last week, before the meeting with the WCC Central Committee, quote, "The relationship of the churches," he meant the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and the Russian Orthodox Church, "and their connection are to strengthen. This is important also as a sign for politics. But the political question doesn't stand at the beginning. For us, Christ is in the center. This is a starting point for dialogue," end of quote. Please, the next slide. To complete the picture, already in 2015, in the aftermath of the Russian takeover of Crimea, Pope Francis told the Ukrainian bishops on their ad limina visit in the Vatican that certain issues of recent history are, quote, "questions which partly have a political basis and to which you are not called to offer a direct response," end of quote. From the Pope's point of view, priority should be given to the pastoral role of church representatives and not to political consideration in addressing the conflict in Ukraine. In the interview, already famous interview with Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, in May 2022, Pope Francis underlined this aspect. Quote, "But I feel that I shouldn't go there, to Kiev, not yet. First I must go to Moscow. I want to meet Putin first of all. But in the end, I'm just a priest. What can I possibly achieve? I'll do what I can," end of quote. So I could add many quotes, I think you are getting to the point. In different variations, we hear the same message by the WCC representatives or by the Pope. None of the mentioned Western church leaders wants to be a politician. None of them wants to interfere in the political sphere or to deal with the political context. Of course, nobody expects religious leaders to act like party politicians. But anyone who calls for ecumenical encounter in which politics is excluded is making things far too easy for themselves, like Джеррі Піллай did. On the contrary, they and we should reflect on how non-theological factors, in the sense of political factors, influence church peace initiatives or ecumenical efforts for dialogue. Otherwise, there would be a blind spot which is only useful for Russian propaganda. In the following, in the second part of the presentation, I will discuss 3 levels in the relationship of political factors and ecumenical dialogue. So the first level, which political reading or interpretation of the conflict? Despite their declared non-political position, the WCC and the Pope have a specific understanding or reading of the war against Ukraine, which implies political presuppositions and consequences. In the before-mentioned quote by Pillai, Pillai demanded not only to put politics aside, but also to put nationalism aside. This statement reflects WCC perceptions of the conflict from the very beginning. After the beginning of the Russian proxy war in Donbass, the WCC sent a delegation to Ukraine in March 2015, which declared after its visit that the churches and faith communities of Ukraine could, quote, play a lead role in transcending the competing nationalisms that predisposed groups toward conflict, end of quote. The narrative of competing nationalism shapes the WCC approach to the conflict, which is a complete misreading of the situation. The Russian aggression in 2014 and after was a reaction to the Ukrainian revolution of dignity, which had not been driven by nationalism. The Russian attack on Ukraine was a form of imperialism or neocolonialism completely overlooked by the WCC. Instead, the narrative of nationalism or the competing nationalisms reinforces an interpretation that puts the aggressor and the attacked on the same level. The statements of the Pope reveal a different interpretation of the conflict. In contrast to the WCC, Francis spoke about imperialism, but for him there are, quote, imperialisms in conflict, causing the war in Ukraine, as he told his Jesuit brothers during his stay in Kazakhstan last September. In an interview, he also repeated the view that the NATO is also responsible for the outbreak of the war by, quote, you all know this quote, barking at the gates of Russia without understanding that the Russians are imperial and fear border insecurity, end of quote. By the end of the last year, Pope Francis stated, quote, this one is a world war, because it is true when empires, either on one side or the other, weaken, they need to make a war in order to feel strong, and also to sell weapons, end of quote. So, while the WCC in its political analysis reduces the causes of the war to competing nationalism, the Pope extended them to clashing imperialisms with Russia on the one side and NATO on the other side. And both readings have the same consequences. They are missing the core of the conflict. That means the imperialism of Russia against Ukraine, and tend to put Ukraine and Russia on equal footing, which also explained Pope Francis' inconsistent statements during the last months. I come to my second level. How to act with a politicized church leadership. The interpretations of the political reasons of the conflict also play a role in the WCC's and Francis' attempts to stay in contact with Patriarch Kirill. Hardly surprising, the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church also claimed not to be a political actor, just like the WCC and the Pope. In the meeting with the WCC General Secretary Sauka, he stated, as Patriarch Kirill stated, quote, The times we live in today are very difficult, yet these difficulties do not come from the churches, but from the political context. And this context constitutes an extreme danger today. End of quote. In a similar way, Kirill stressed by the end of November 2022 that the church in no way interferes in politics. During yesterday's panel discussion, we heard a lot of examples of the political acting of Patriarch Kirill. The problem is how to address them when both sides have been using the same ecumenical language up to now, claiming that they are in favor of dialogue and peaceful conflict resolution. In his conversation with Sauka, Patriarch Kirill even went so far as stating that, in his opinion, quote, the WCC today has taken the only proper position, active but neutral, taking no political side in this conflict. The churches by nature have a peacemaking potential, and if a church starts waving a flag of war and calling for confrontation, it acts against its nature. End of quote. We are facing a massive manipulation and falsification of the ecumenical language by Patriarch Kirill. In his speeches and sermons, he is constantly waving the flag of war, producing enemy images like the rotten West. At the Sunday of Orthodoxy this year, he differentiated Russia from innovations in Western philosophy and theology. He criticized the relativization of basic values in favor of so-called universal values, which meant Western values. Putin is using the same anti-Western narrative. In his State of the Nation address, by end of February, the Russian president condemned the Western rejection of traditional values. It is obvious that the president and the patriarch are using the same narrative and enemy images to legitimize the war against Ukraine. But the evidence seems not, or only to a lesser extent, visible for some Western ecumenical interlocutors. They try to hold on to the chimera of a separation of the religious and the political sphere, as they are used to do with ecumenical encounters in the last decades. But this practice doesn't work anymore when faced with a highly politicized church leadership. One must find a new language and new strategies in dealing with the Russian Orthodox Church. One reason for the lost language of ecumenism, as my colleague Regina Elsner described the phenomenon, is that Western ecumenical interlocutors have been silent far too long on the church discourse of so-called traditional values, which has domestic political consequences for Russia itself as well as for its foreign relations. This is not a new development. For many years one could observe the politicization of the Moscow Patriarchate, which Cyril Hoveroon, already mentioned him, has described as political orthodoxy. The silence of Western ecumenical actors with regard to these processes can be partly explained in two ways. Either they feared to destroy the last official dialogue formats with the Russian Orthodox Church, as it is the case with some Western Protestant churches, or they welcomed the Russian Orthodox Church engagement for traditional values. This was, and perhaps still is, the case with some Catholic circles and evangelical groups. In this context, one must mention the keyword strategic alliance for the ecumenical dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. The idea of the strategic alliance was promoted particularly by the former head of the Department for External Church Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate, Metropolitan Ilarion Alfeev. The common ground between both churches was a common front against secular and liberal values, which were considered the cause for the decline of Christianity in modern Western society. I come to my third level. New hermeneutics of theological and non-theological factors within the ecumenical dialogue. On the third and more general level, we must reconsider the mechanisms of ecumenical dialogues. Indeed, it might be a consensus that ecumenical dialogues are shaped by theological factors, for instance, dogmatical issues or different religious traditions, and non-theological factors like various cultural contexts and political influences. But this approach should lead us to the assumption that we could strictly separate both sectors to get a pure theological field to concentrate on. Non-theological factors like issues of power and identity are also play an important role in influencing theological thought and church acting, which we should consider. Therefore, it would be also too simple to speak only of an instrumentalization of religious communities or religious symbolic in conflict situations, as it often happened. Of course, there are such cases, but the case of the Russian Orthodox Church nowadays, or the acting and positioning of religious communities during the bloody dissolution of Yugoslavia, which is actually my research area, show that church actors are independent actors with their own interests and aims, and not only puppets of politicians. The political and religious legitimization of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine are intertwined. It requires an ecumenical hermeneutics which reflects on these connections and avoids a simple model of instrumentalization. I will come to my conclusion. In the movie Groundhog Day, Bill Murray performs a learning curve so that in the end he can finally, next slide, so that in the end he can finally escape from the time loop. In the ecumenical context, we see some learning effects, but still also mistakes being repeated in dealing with the Russian Orthodox Church by ecumenical actors. A learning curve is only possible, first, with a proper interpretation of the political causes of the conflict. Second, with a clear theological critique of the politicized role of the Russian Orthodox Church. And third, with an ecumenical hermeneutics which doesn't put politics aside. I wanted to end my presentation yesterday with this statement, but then I saw the yesterday's new. Therefore, I will conclude my presentation with a photo of a handshake as I have begun. Please, the next. I think everybody knows the most person here. It's Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, the Pope's peace envoy, and Moscow's Ombudsman for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, wanted by an international arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. Even though the aim of the meeting was to free kidnapped Ukrainian children, Cardinal Zuppi should avoid such pictures serving only the Russian propaganda. It seems to me that we are unfortunately in a time loop and that we will see new episodes of Groundhog Day concerning ecumenical encounters. And this is not a comedy like in the movie with Bill Murray, it's a tragedy that costs Ukrainian lives every day. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan, for your presentation, and that you raised the question that this war is not only the war of tanks and missiles, but it's first of all the war of concepts and narratives, and which is also very important in the ecumenical movement, when those people who are interested and want to be engaged in the ecumenical movement should clean their concept of theological perceiving what is peace, what is reconciliation, what is the role of the churches. Coming to our next speaker, Father Yury Avvakumov, who came from the state. He's a professor of theology and history of Christianity at the University of Notr-Dam. The father also is a member of the Vatican's International Theological Commission, and I would add that father was a former dean of humanities in our university, Ukrainian Catholic University. Father Yury today will present his speech entitled "Is the World Christian Community Still Plausible After Bucha? Ecumenical Reflections."
Thank you very much. Could you first return to the initial slide? Just.
No. 1 minute, please.
must start with saying a word of thanks to my co-panelists who have brought such a wealth of detail into our conversation that it makes my task both easier as well as more challenging in a sense. So we'll have to skip something of what I prepared for my talk and perhaps to add something right on the spot. And maybe I would try to bring, to add a little more reflection and maybe even theory to our conversation. You see these words from Jeremiah that I have chosen as a motto for my talk, but I would like to start, and I will return to it at the end, but I would like to start with Theodor Adorno. He is the author of the following words: "To write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric. Nach Auschwitz ein Gedicht zu schreiben ist barbarisch." This Adorno's comment has been quoted innumerable times since the date of its appearance, mostly often, however, in a somewhat distorted form. That is something like, "It is impossible to write poetry after Auschwitz." The word barbarity is thus often lost, despite its indispensability for Adorno's concept. For in his authentic comment, the German philosopher proceeded from the opposition between barbarism and culture. In a simplified form, the meaning of his phrase could be summarized as follows: what had been considered culture before Auschwitz, after Auschwitz, becomes its opposite. The denial of culture, barbarism. The poem, one of the highest, most beautiful forms of literary culture, sounds false, looks like anti-culture, like barbarism, when we realize the fact that the Germans, who were considered a highly cultured nation, known for their achievements, including those in the field of literature, fell into such a terrifying moral abyss that led to anti-human barbaric horrors of Auschwitz. And moreover, Auschwitz itself, with its modern, highly rationalized and sophisticated machine of killing people, is a result of modern culture. A culture that became a negation of itself, an anti-culture. Adorno's thought, of course, relates to his and Horkheimer's famous thesis on the Dialektik der Aufklärung, dialectics of the Enlightenment, emphasizing that the Enlightenment is fraught with barbarism, at times diametrically opposite to the initial optimistic expectations of Enlightenment's philosophers. Today, we are witnessing historical events no less dramatic than those that Adorno had in mind when he worded his comment. The crimes against humanity committed by Russians are looking more and more similar to those of the National Socialist regime. And today, like it was then, this makes us think about the relationship between culture and barbarism as two opposites on the one hand, and about their sometimes paradoxical and dialectical interpenetration on the other. Russians, who were considered a cultured nation, commit horrible barbaric crimes today. The name Bucha has become their symbol, like Auschwitz during the Second World War. And we can only surmise with fear what further dimensions of barbarism will be revealed after all the occupied territories are liberated. We are still living in the whirlwind of these events, and it is premature to draw far-reaching conceptual constructions about them at this point. However, one very important result is obvious. The war exposes and reveals the true nature of human beings and their actions. It becomes clear who is who and what is what. Our sessions focuses on ecumenical efforts. In the title of my talk, I use the phrase world Christian community, which might seem somewhat vague at first glance. Let me explain that I refer under this name to those persons, boardrooms, and structures that claim to represent world's Christianity, to serve as its public voice and its moral authority. This includes various international and national ecumenical organizations, such as the World Council of Churches, but also Pope Francis with the apparatus of the Roman Curia, which has the task to assist him in his decision-making and creating his public image. Acting in an interdenominational and interreligious context, Pope Francis becomes a part of the world Christian community and one of its ecumenical actors. This war, and we have seen this clearly in the whole course of our discussions, has revealed numerous shortcomings of the international political community in its approaches to Russia and the former Eastern Bloc, flaws that remained previously unseen. The same is no less true of ecumenical relations and ecumenical diplomacy. Well, I have here my examples, but I will skip them. Yeah, we have heard in full and in richness these examples of ecumenical community missing very important things and points. I would like, however, to dwell not so much on the details of the current activities in the ecumenical sphere, but to point to some fundamental problems of ecumenism. The lack of ability to change has deep roots in the failures of ecumenical ideas and practices that go back at least to the second half of the 20th century, maybe even deeper. These problems, although they were occasionally pointed out by some unbiased observers, nevertheless remained unnoticed or ignored by Christian international public opinion for decades. It is today, in the result of the war, that they begin to be seen with all clarity and acuteness. If I could have this, my second slide, this would be helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to speak about these three factors, and you can call them three failures. Number one, confessionalist foundations of the ecumenical movement, quoting once, ignoring others. I begin as a theologian with an ecclesiological fact that is rarely recognized by admirers of the ecumenical movement and its official actors. Ecumenism originated in the first quarter of the 20th century as a protest against confessionalism, especially against the extremely acute confessionalization of the so-called Second Confessional Era of the long 19th century. That is the period from the French Revolution to the outbreak of the First World War. At first glance, confessionalism and ecumenism are direct opposites. The desire for peace, mutual understanding and unity between confessions on the one hand, and fostering distinctions, divisions, and even enmity between confessions on the other look like antipodes indeed. However, precisely because ecumenism emerged as a response to confessionalism, it became determined by confessionalism. Like a photographic positive is determined by its photographic negative. Both confessionalism and ecumenism employ confessional categories as their main tools. On the international ecumenical stage, confession, or denomination, works like nation-state, of international political theory. For the ecumenical movement, the Christian world is the world divided in confessions or denominations, like the international political order is founded on nation-states for politicians. Hence, the creation of the World Council of Churches, the organization that since its foundation in 1948 has had the ambition to become the ecumenical counterpart to the United Nations. The division of the Christian world into plurality of denominations generally accepted by Protestant Christianity is from the strictly dogmatic point of view alien to the Roman Catholic Church and to the churches of the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox traditions. When explaining their church and tradition to non-Catholic, particularly Protestant readers, Roman Catholic authors emphasize that Catholicism is not a denomination. Similarly, Eastern Orthodox theologians assert that the Orthodox Church is neither a sect nor a denomination, I'm just quoting from some publications, but the true Church of God. When faced with such statements, however, we begin to realize how divergent ecclesiological theory and ecclesial reality can be. The Catholic and Orthodox theological declarations can hardly change anything in the way the non-Catholic and non-Orthodox world approaches Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox communities. Moreover, and they approach them as confessions. Moreover, ecclesiological theory does not even fully match the practical outlook widely accepted within the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox churches themselves. The realities of the contemporary world are such that the leaders and the members of any religious community must recognize, in some fashion or another, the confessional denominational plurality of the world, even if their official theology holds their community for the one true church and denies ecclesial fullness to others. This plurality might be undesired, but the community is forced to tolerate it, however reluctantly, and to fashion its practical thinking and behavior accordingly. Such a fixation on confessional communities functioning like nation-states goes in the ecumenical movement hand in glove with a clear preference for group rights over individual rights. Those in power in the respective confessional churches determine the international ecumenical order. And I think many of the examples that have been brought just now by my colleagues can demonstrate this well. This is still a power politics to a great extent. I think I'll skip again my examples. Yeah, I will go ahead. I think we have heard very good examples of that. My second. Exactly to this first point. It is one factor that I would like to add to the examples, which I think is very important. This is the fact that all 2 or 3 so-called non-canonical Orthodox churches, in Ukraine, prior to the unification and to the establishment of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that they were completely neglected by the international ecumenical movement. They were non-existent at all. And we must really clearly see and never get tired of reminding the actors and the leaders and the members of the ecumenical international boardrooms of their flaw and failure in that. Because it contradicts the very foundations of the ecumenical idea as it was first formulated inclusiveness. Inclusiveness of all Christian community, who, of course, they must fulfill this general norm concerning faith in Jesus Christ as the Savior, but otherwise, it opens up possibilities of one church saying, don't accept the other one because he doesn't like me, and this is not the right way of practicing what should be called ecumenism. Now, point two, there is another factor. In the time of the Cold War, and this factor is influence of leftist and pacifist ideology, peace rhetoric and dialogue at any price. The ecumenical movement in the time of the Cold War was closely linked with leftist and pacifist ideology, at least in many circles in ecumenical movement. This could not fail to attract the attention of Soviet curators of religious policy in the USSR. It is generally known that the official struggle for peace served as an instrument of international communist politics of the war and abused the pacifist sentiments of the Western public. Churches of the Eastern Bloc countries were an important part of this policy. The policy of infiltration of the ecumenical movement with Soviet agents and influence through church representatives was carried out by clever methods. We must recognize that there was a presence of some representatives who might have some sincere ideas about Christian unity and theological conversations, but even they were instrumentalized by the Soviet state and the Soviet policy. And what we see today is that heritage, even up to our day in the World Council of Churches. There are still people, for example, in the Central Committee of the WCC, there are still some people who were there at that time, in the time of the Cold War. From the Russian Orthodox Church. Pacifist ideology is another facet of this failure. We hear repeated attempts to urge Ukraine towards non-violent resistance. There is so much dogmatism and such a lack of most elementary ethical compassion in such calls. I would only quote perhaps something that has not yet been mentioned, the statements of a German theologian, Egon Spiegel, perhaps you know, but this is perhaps the most drastic example, but there are so many. For instance, on the pages of La Croix, we had similar calls for non-violent resistance directed to Ukrainians. It stinks to call Ukrainians to non-violent resistance and decry NATO's escalating arms supplies for Ukraine out of the comfort and security of Western and West-allied democracies, provided, by the way, by that same NATO, in particular, among many other things. When I hear such calls for nonviolent resistance, one parallel occurs to me. I think it's an interesting parallel. I would like to share this with you. I'm thinking about a famous, very, very famous figure in Russian Orthodoxy of the imperial period of the 19th century, Metropolitan Filaret Drozdov of Moscow. I'm sure that many of you, maybe some of you, know the name. One of the most famous Russian Orthodox hierarchs of the 19th century, who is known for his justification of the extreme cruelty of Russian penitentiary system in the time of Nicholas I. You can read his thought. There was a small collection of his state teaching. The title, the Russian title, "Государственное учение митрополита Филарета Moskovskого," the state teaching of Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, a collection of his excerpts from his writings. And what we find there, in response to the critique of the Russian Orthodox Church, that it did not care at all and did not condemn the atrocity of Russian prisons, and did not demand from the state the improvement of its penitentiary system, the Metropolitan replied, "We don't have to do this for high spiritual reasons. The suffering of the criminal in this life is for his benefit. For these sufferings help him to get redeemed, so that his or her destiny in the afterlife is alleviated." The inverted, anti-moral logic of these pseudo-spiritual considerations reminds me of the logic of modern Western pacifist ecumenists, sticking to their dogmaticism and at the same time blatantly indifferent to the suffering of the other. Overall, let me say, Ukrainians, and I would say not only Ukrainians, but so many people affected by conflicts, I think are tired, weary of beautiful words today. And in this context, could we briefly return to number one? Yeah. I'm finishing. In this context, I'm thinking about these words from Jeremiah. By saying peace, peace, it seems that the church actors and ecumenical actors are trying, as it were, to conjure peace. But peace cannot be conjured. And even I would go dare to go even further and say, even prayer, even constant references to praying, can reach the limit. Prayers are beautiful, but show me the actions of ecclesiastical actors. Now I will try to finish as soon as I can. Sorry, it's. Could we return to the second one? I'm sorry for this. My final point, very briefly, I will not read from the text. I'll just say it in a few words. The third problem is susceptibility to imperialist narratives, which looks interesting in the context of number two, influence of leftist and pacifist ideology. But the link that I find here is, of course, the role of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, or at least the narrative about the role of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, which immediately makes both leftists, so to say, and rightists susceptible to imperialist narratives, which implies also the mythologization of Russia and neglecting Ukraine. I will not dwell on this. I think that motive of decolonizing Eastern European studies and also ecumenism with Eastern churches think is important here. So let me conclude. To conclude, let me return to the initial Adorno's quotation. I contrast ecumenism as a desire for mutual understanding, peace, and ultimately unity among Christians around the world, and war in any form, from purely secular, political, and to confessional and religious. At the first and most obvious glance, ecumenism and war are opposites, just as culture and barbarism are antipodes in Adorno. However, Adorno's comment quoted at the beginning urges us to be cautious and nuanced about this contrast. Ecumenism, in its real embodiment, turns out to be no less a dialectical phenomenon than the ideology of the Enlightenment. The problems of modern ecumenism cannot be explained away simply by demanding more ecumenism. No, at the very core of what we know as the 20th century ecumenism, there are a few fundamental problems. Russia's war against Ukraine has exposed these problems. It revealed the place of modern ecumenical ideology as it has evolved over the past 100 years. Is the world Christian community still plausible after Bucha? I think it is still plausible, but this plausibility is endangered. Can one practice the same ecumenism today as it had been practiced before? My answer is certainly no. Therefore, I called my talk Un-Ecumenical Relations. The challenge of the historical moment is so high that we need a new beginning. A conversion of heart and renouncing hypocrisy is needed. In order to remain credible, the Christian world of tomorrow has to become post-confessional. And that means also post-ecumenical. Thank you very much. And let me very briefly just add that I would like to, right after these words, I would like to say a word of support for Pani Alexandra и Pani Natalia. I admire what you do, and I encourage you to continue. Don't understand my talk as an attempt to, suppress or to put to question what you are doing. Please, more courage, more action, more boldness with your own work and with your own foundation. So only so we can really bring the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Yuri, for your encouragement to Alexandra, Natalia, and to all of us. And with your topic, we are switching to final part of our session, that is question and answer session. And please raise your hands and I will come to you with the microphone. I'm sure you have questions to our team.
Okay. First of all, I would like to applaud all participants of this panel for their presentations. It was very rich. I understand the danger of politics in ecumenism. And let's say politics is motivated by ideology. And ideology is always a dangerous moment for me. But at the same time, it seems to me that distancing from politics also has some ideological aspects. And sometimes I even question whether ecumenical leaders read the Bible, read the New Testament often. Let me give you 3 examples. There was a phrase, we are motivated by language of faith. Language of faith means we do not demonize. Is it true? a minute, but it was Jesus himself who told to his main apostle, "Go away from me, Satan." So when apostle declined from the heavenly thinking to earthly thinking. That was one point. The second point, dialogue at any price. Dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. But again, Jesus was not against the dialogue with the Sanhedrin, but he insisted that this dialogue has to be held in truth. That was the point. Not dialogue at any cost, dialogue for dialogue, but dialogue in truth. That is the point. And the third point, Ambassador Tombinsky told very, very important thing, that Roman Catholic Church in Russia is silent. Why? Their normal human explanation is because they are in danger. If they speak loudly, then they will be persecuted. And my question is, what would be with our Christian church if Apostle Peter and other apostles appeal to their communities, be silent, because if you speak loudly, you will be persecuted. So I cannot imagine Christian church without understanding the importance of sacrifice in favor of truth. So that is my question to you. What can we do to convince the ecumenical movement not to be attached to this ideology of political correctness that substitutes the logic of faith? Thank you.
Yeah, I want to continue this discussion, not directly answering a question, but to maybe responding also to Professor Avvakumov and about, for example, pacifism. I think that pacifists are, in reality, there are no pacifists per se. There are different types of pacifists. And some pacifist movements, they don't deny the right of Ukrainian people to fight for their independence or for their country. And that's why I think we also have like very many like labels, and we put labels on different people, and also on WCC. There is no WCC as a unity does not exist. So that's why there is no strategy of WCC towards the conflict in Ukraine, because WCC consists of different people. And what I wanted to present, and I had no time, is that first of all we should think not what ecumenical movement should do, not what the Vatican should do in the present conflict, or what they are doing bad way. But I think it's very important for us to think what do we do not in the right way. Because I think that Ukrainian churches are not doing well in the ecumenical movement for certain points. Because, for example, if you start, if you meet a pacifist and you start to say, no, we need weapons, and pacifists say, no, we need peace, and there is no dialogue, they cannot understand what you want from them. And we need to develop, that's why it's very important for us to understand these concerns, to Джерrі Піллай, for example, or people coming from South African context, people coming from Latin American context, liberation theology context, people coming from pacifist movement from Western countries, people coming from Pacific Ocean. They have their concerns, they have their concepts, and also they're not. It's not always that they're sitting somewhere comfortably in the chair and commenting what Ukrainians should do, how they should reconcile with Russians. Many people also come from contexts where they are suffering, where they are persecuted, where there is no justice, where they are losing their countries, or there's a very tragic context all over the world. And I think that the big mistake is that we always, when we imagine ecumenical movement, we imagine it as some Western churches. And we try to negotiate with them, because the West can give weapons. Of course, Africa cannot help, Pacific cannot help, we think so. We also try to orient on someone who is powerful, as Ukrainians, or as, okay. I also, identify myself, so, because we want something from them. But it is very important to reconsider ourselves, not expecting that now some big guy will come and save us from Russia. That's why we need to reach out Pacific. Like Alexandra showed an example, how reaching those who are victims of propaganda, those who don't know anything about the context. To speak with African churches is important. To speak with Latin American churches is important. And we don't have a language for this. For many people in global Christianity, it's a global South Christianity. The majority of people, why it was not possible to, why it was possible to kick out the Russian Orthodox Church from WCC? Because the majority of churches coming from global South, they don't understand why. They don't understand what happens. They don't support it. They see there is some white people in European countries, you know, like some European conflict, and we have these conflicts in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Asia. So for many it's just two European very wealthy countries which has something to do with each other, and they try to have this power games and dominate each other, and why we in Africa should relate to it. So that's speaking with pacifists, so trying to reach out other discourses, and not only to oppose some manipulations, but also to understand that people that people are not bad, so they don't sit there and say, we just like Russia and we will support it. But many people, they don't understand, and it's our task to explain them in their language, in their experience, how what is happening. And I think that's very crucial, and it's a long. So the Ukrainian churches need also to reconsider their own activities in the ecumenical arena.
If I may, I want to react to the statement by Miroslav Marinovic on the relationship between theology and politics. I must admit I have studied in Münster, the German city of Münster. It's famous for the new political theology by Johann Baptist Metz. And to put it very simple, the message of this theology is, every theological statement is also a statement about the world, about the political sphere, the broadest sense of the word. There aren't any eternal theological statements and messages somewhere above of us. This is ideology. Then you are practicing ideology, and we need, I think you pointed out very well, we need a theology with open eyes. So Johann Baptist Metz has spoken about theology after Auschwitz, you have spoken about after Butcher. And it's theology which is open for the suffering of the people. And every theological statement should be open. And just to add, you mentioned at the beginning this famous statement by Adorno. he borrowed it originally by Bertolt Brecht. Bertolt Brecht has once written a poem, how to write a poem after Auschwitz. Wie kann man ein Gedicht nach Auschwitz schreiben? And then Adorno said this phrase, it's impossible to write a poem after Auschwitz. But many people forget that he added this phrase in his book Negative Dialectics after the Second World War. There he said it might be right to say you cannot write a poem after Auschwitz, but on the other hand, the victim has all right to express its suffering, its losses, and that is the other side of the medal. And so this is really needed even today to create a theology which is open for the cries of the victims and those who are suffering.
A really short answer to Pan Miroslav. First of all, thank you for your contribution, and I think that it is very important. The only way we can influence the ecumenical community, I think, with the world of gospel, to remind them, as you did, those simple truths, even though it feels very, I would say, challenging psychologically when you feel like you're the voice of someone, somehow you're like screaming in the desert. When you're speaking to the church community and to people who should be the ones supporting us and standing with those who are suffering, it is very challenging to be in that place, but I think it's the only way that we remind the churches and the ecumenical communities what are the bases that we should stand for. So it's our only chance to go back to where we belong and where we come from.
I would have some short question to Natalia. First, could you share about emotions or real opinions about the war of the Russian participants of the councils? I'm interested in how the people really react, perhaps after this official facilities. Are they support Putin and war, or somehow hesitate? This is the first. And second, frankly speaking, I'm very skeptic of the project you participated. Could you very shortly summarize what is the added value of the council like that? What is the real sense for being in the council like that? What is the real effect? It is war for.
Oh, okay, the first thing I must tell about so the delegation of the Russian Church does not speak their own opinion. And that's also the problem of dialogue, because when people are coming from some churches, and when there is a conflict, and there is a subject of conflict, and two parties who are in conflict, they share different positions, they can come and negotiate and discuss, that's our position, and that's our position. Let's find a common ground. But the problem of the participation in the ecumenical movement of the Russian Church is that people who represent the position of the Russian Church do not believe in it, on the one hand. On the other hand, they try to. So it's a completely like they're not sincere. So people who advocate for official position of Russian Orthodox Church do not agree with this position. It's a very strange schizophrenia, and that's why it's more difficult to engage in conversation, because there is no emotions. From their side, there is no emotions at all. Because they don't need emotions. You cannot reach the emotions, because even if you destroy their position, they don't feel anything, because it's nothing happened. It's just the work, and that's also part of problem. But yes, but what I find very interesting, and I think it's also very important when we speak about one of strategies how we managed to make Russian delegation to vote for this document they were not happy about. That was bringing voices, alternative voices from Russian Orthodox Church. For example, it was also my project. I brought a priest, Belarusian priest from the Russian Orthodox Church to the assembly as a youth participant, and I always was taken with him. And this is when people say Russian Orthodox Church has this opinion, and say here is a priest of Russian Orthodox Church, and he will present a different opinion against the war and so on. And it breaks propaganda very well when you present these alternative opinions, when you know the cases and so on. And also very important thing that this success in the ecumenical arena of Ukrainian cause, it was a relative success in KEC assembly, in the assembly of WCC. Ukrainian Orthodox Church, participation of Ukrainian Orthodox Church, I think it has a key value, because Russian propaganda always tried to represent since 2014 the whole situation that there is like our church there and it's persecuted by non-canonical groups and so on. But when now you can shut them up with Metropolitan Onufry, you can using his statements, you know, like they have nothing to say when they try to advocate for rights of Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Then Ukrainian Orthodox Church immediately counter-reacts. So Ukrainian Orthodox Church is counter-reacting to Russian narratives now in the ecumenical movement, and people start to trust, even because it's associated with Moscow Patriarchate, people trust them more because they're like coming in position of their, like from the same ground. So it's not like a conflict, like alternative positions are very important. If we speak about WCC as if there is a sense to participate in it, of course there is a sense. Because as I said, people are not doing on purpose something bad for Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine to be non-existent. They don't want that Russia just takes over the Ukraine. They do it not because of bad will. Many people do it because of the lack of knowledge, lack of information, lack of understanding. And it is very important to reach out. If Ukraine would be oriented not only to Europe, but also to the global south, again, I come to this, there would be no problem to speak, even to kick out the Russian Orthodox Church but only Europeans were aware, because it's European context, they more or less know what happens in Europe. And I think it's also not to prevent, to take some kind of support is very important for Ukraine, and that's why people, all our conference is here. Why we are not heard? Why we are not understood? Why the diplomatic institutions or world community do not respond as we want? And WCC is one of platforms which you know, it's like different culture, churches, science, and so on. We need to work in all directions. We need to work to all directions to be understood, finally to be heard, and finally to be supported in our cause. Yeah, so I think it's very important to do this.
Father Yuri.
Pani Natalio, I really wholeheartedly agree with most of what you are saying, particularly when you speak about our understanding, attempts to find understanding with the third world representatives. And I also think that the participation in such organizations like the World Council of Churches really makes sense, and that was my point of my final comment that I made after I finished my talk. And still, you know, I must confess I'm an old dinosaur. My first encounter with the World Council of Churches and its structures and its representatives dates back to 1990. So I know what I'm speaking about. Of course, I don't know the perhaps from personal experience most recent developments, only from reports and from coverage, but there is indeed such a thing like the power of apparatus and the power of structures at the World Council of Churches, which is undeniable, and I'm sure it is still so, and which also determines the overall culture, the culture of dialogue, the culture of and the manner of representation from the churches, and the manner of handling the member churches. Just as an example, maybe, the Russian Orthodox Church claims 113 million membership, which is an instrument of sending huge delegations to world assemblies of the WCC and so on. Such things depend upon the certain apparatus decision among many other things. So there are some procedures, some structures that play a role. And here, and I understand your point that you say, here we have to do with real people, representatives of various churches, and contrary to what we find in the representation of from the Moscow Patriarchate, there are indeed often real people, so to say, grassroots people. But let me continue my comparison with the United Nations. United Nations is also has the certain apparatus and structure problems which we see today, in particular, of course, first and foremost, the Security Council and so on. The WCC doesn't have quite similar structures, but it does have, I think, a certain overall culture which is determined by some structural elements. And I think that the task of Ukrainian representatives, I didn't mean my talk as, demands to the others. If you wish, the very idea of going back to the roots to the confessionalist roots of ecumenist structures, parallelism between church representation and nation-state representation, which implies elements of power politics, despite contrary to some grassroots rhetoric. Those are such things that I think Ukraine would be able to bring and contribute, positively contribute, not in the understanding of we demand, from the others. We are contributing by furthering the ecumenical theology towards maybe even a new future. Because I think it's not occasional, not accidental that the word ecumenism still evokes some problems with so many churches, and not only exclusively those of ultra-conservative values. So just as a matter of brief response to your comments, for which I'm greatly thankful.
First of all, I would like to apologize that we can continue our discussion because we have lunchtime, but please remember your questions and you can ask them to our panelists during the break, or even to during our fourth session, which will be run after in 2 hours or in one hour. 1 hour, almost in
40 minutes.
In 40 minutes. And as a second, I would like to express my gratitude for all the panelists, which raised important issues and discussions in this room, and to all the participants who participated today in our discussion, and wish you continue our fruitful discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
The